3617, respond to report of shots fired.
The Coroner Talk podcast takes you behind the scenes with coroners, clinicians, and death investigators from around the world to provide training, news, and interviews from leading experts in the area of death investigation and scene management, bringing real stories and solid training together in one source. Now, here's your host, Darren Day.
Well, hello and welcome to Coroner Talk, the only podcast in iTunes dedicated to the men and women working the field of death investigation. Now, that includes coroners, medical examiners, police, and any other interested party or supporting roles. Man, I've said that a lot over the years, but welcome to 2022. And I hope it doesn't turn out like the memes where it's 2020 TOO, like 2020 also. Hope it's not that. Hope it's 2022 is a great, healthy, prosperous year for everyone. Looking forward to that. So today, got a lot going on today. Today, we're going to talk about death due to altitude sickness. I've got a guest coming on named Wendy Kipple, which we're going to introduce her more in a moment. And she is going to probably be a regular on the show. And here in a minute, I'll let her tell you more and more about her and her experience. She's been in law enforcement and the coroner, deputy coroner for many, many years, and she's worked a lot of death. And so she's going to be an asset to the show and to you to be able to pull the information from her from a different perspective. She's located in Colorado. I'm located in Missouri. So we do have a different perspective on things, which is great. Before we get into the show, I always want to make sure you are aware that we have not only have we added a gob of new online courses since we last spoke last year, we also have a bunch of online courses. And so you can go to online and classroom. You can go to coronertalk.com, click on the Academy link in the upper menu. From there, you can either go to online or classroom, and it shows you the schedules of both. We have a lot of them. And of course, our medical legal death investigator course, our 1-week course in Missouri, every March, every October. It's coming up in March of 2022 as well. Our next online MDI is January 8th, so you might have missed that or been right at the last day before we can enroll. And then the next one starts in March, but you'll find those on the website, and you can enroll if you're interested in an online. Now, we do allow students to take those courses that are not currently working in the field because we want to prepare you to take a job and be better applicant for that job and be trained a little bit going in rather than starting out at ground zero. So, with all of that said, let me just clip over here to Wendy, and let's introduce her, and let's kind of talk today about altitude sickness.
Adjust your earbuds, turn up those speakers, and hang on. It's now time for this week's featured conversation.
All right, I'm back, and as I I teased a little bit about Wendy, and Wendy is here. Wendy, welcome to the Coroner Talk podcast.
Thank you, Darren.
So that you're going to be around quite a bit, and, we've taken a little bit of a break, and now we're kicking back off for 2022. We've had about a 6-month break, so now listeners are coming back in, but they're hearing these new voices that's going to be on the show quite a bit. And so why don't you just take a little bit of time, tell us about who you are, your career. I mean, I know when you was born, you were very, very young back then. You don't remember all those things. But tell us about your career, who you are, and interests and things like that. And then what kind of sets you up as a good, co-host guest on the Coroner Talk podcast and what we can kind of gain from you.
All right. Well, I was raised here in the mountains of Colorado. I grew up in Dillon, Colorado, and I have been in law enforcement. I accidentally got into the field of law enforcement. I grew up wanting to be a horse trainer, and I accidentally got into law enforcement in Summit County, Colorado, and got on with the Summit County Sheriff's Office. And that's where that sparked my interest in law enforcement. and investigations. And while I was there at the Summit County Sheriff's Office, I was asked by one of the detectives there, said, hey, you might want to come out on, if you're interested in investigations, why don't you come out on some death investigations and see if you're interested in working for the coroner's office as well. So I did that, and got really interested in it, and kind of the rest is history, so they say. I worked at the Summit County Sheriff's Office for 4.5 years. I went to Dillon Police Department, where I worked for, I think it was 16 years. And there I climbed up through the ranks to sergeant and was sergeant for 12 of those years. I got trained to be an evidence technician and crime scene investigator, went to lots of crime scene investigation classes, as well as I rode horses on mounted patrol once a week during the summer. My patrol car converted to 4 legs with the mane and tail. And I also had a canine for 14 years, worked canine, did a lot of fun stuff at Dillon Police Department. And in all that time, I was still working for the coroner's office. I've done that with every law enforcement job. I've also told whoever was my boss at the law enforcement agency, I'm also working for the coroner's office, and that's where I'm going to stay. So everybody's been supportive of that and have supported the knowledge that I bring to investigations at a law enforcement agency from a death investigator's perspective. And then when I retired from Dillon PD, I was kind of doing the retirement route for most law enforcement and worked as an investigator for a district attorney's office in Park County, and was there for 4 years. And then when our new sheriff was elected in 2019, he asked me to come to the Park County Sheriff's Office and be his detective sergeant for investigations and oversee evidence as well. So this year is going to be my 33rd year in law enforcement and 32 years as a death investigator at the coroner's office.
Well, you have a similar path to mine as far as beginning in law enforcement and then jumping into the coroner's office as well. And so I've kind of run both dual roles as an investigator and stuff too. So, and again, I want our listeners to know, certainly with both of us having law enforcement backgrounds and both of us still be a commissioned law enforcement, I'm an elected coroner where I'm at now. Wendy is a deputy coroner where she's at. But you certainly don't have to be law enforcement to be in the coroner or medical legal field. In fact, most coroners and medical examiner investigators are not law enforcement. But we do bring a very unique perspective to things because we see both sides. And Wendy, this is why in our office, now that I'm elected in my county, we're building a new morgue. And we're moving eventually next year be moving all of our autopsies to this county rather than having to go to the next county, and a lot of improvements. But one thing that I'm doing with my investigators is they are going to classes on crime scene processing and new detective training. And someone asked me one time, said, well, why are you sending them to that when they have no commissions, they have no powers of arrest? Why are you sending them to new detective training and crime scene training? They don't do that. You're right. They don't, except sometimes in these small departments, they can help. And I say, if they don't help, then at least they know how to stay out of the way. Because if they know what you have to do, if they know what the police have to do in these bigger agencies that we work in, now they can stay out of the way because they know what they're coming in for. And so I like them to know both perspectives. And I said, I'm not trying to make the investigators cops. I'm just trying to make them better investigators all the way around. So, right. I think it's important for coroner investigators to learn that. But we're rabbit trailing off of our topic here just a little bit. But unfortunately, nationwide, there's a lot of problems and you can tell I'm being careful. Coroners don't see that they are an investigative branch. So a lot of times there's a lot of mini coroners in the country that just feel like they are tell me what you want me to put on the death certificate and that's what I'll do. And every state has some of that. It's not just a state. Every state has a little of that go on, or quite a bit of that go on. And Colorado, no different. Missouri, no different. I'm sure you've seen and heard those things around your state.
Oh, yeah.
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 So,
I do a lot of trainings with my unique position in being both a commissioned law enforcement officer and a death investigator with the coroner's office. I do trainings in Summit County for our law enforcement agencies. There's 5 agencies in Summit County, and I do what I call my Coroner 101 training. It's like, how can we work together?
Yes.
How do we do a death investigation and the cops get what they need and the coroner's office gets what we need? And sometimes I have that unique perspective of I know what both sides need.
Yeah. No, that's very, very good. And I wish more agencies that maybe they aren't commissioned police officers, but they would bring in some police officers as a deputy investigator, or if not that, then at least come in and have them do some co-training, because the co-training is where it starts with cooperation on the scene, not the argument at the scene level. So, yes. So very, very good. A lot of experience. We're going to have a lot of fun this year with a lot of different shows and episodes that we have planned, and I think we're going to do well with our different experiences, different cultures, different parts of the state. It feels like Colorado right now here because it's like 9, right? So we don't always
we're
get
warmer
that.
than you today. I think we got up to like 35 or 36 today.
Oh, man, it's crazy. It's going to be like every night this week's going to be cold, and it's just crazy. The first week we've been great. In fact, Christmas Day was like 75, which isn't always the case, but it's 75. And then now the first week of January is like single digits at night. So, but that's Missouri. Missouri is the only state that you can have all 4 seasons in 1 week. And that's the way it is in Missouri. So,
yeah.
So, well, let's get into the topic at hand. When I started the show, I told everybody we were going to be talking about altitude sickness and death due to altitude sickness and things like that. And you have experienced that being in the upper altitudes in Colorado. So, how many feet? What's your altitude of where you work in Park County?
Where I work at in Park County, I believe we're at 10,000. Right about 10,000 feet. My house sits at 10,380 feet.
I was out in Colorado last year, I guess, meeting with you and some of the other ones out there. I can't breathe out there. Now, you guys came off the mountain down to the training.
Right.
It was still higher than my elevation is 477 feet.
Yeah,
that's my
Denver
elevation.
is 5,280 feet.
Yeah, and
is the altitude there.
And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Jackson. Now, Jackson is right at 6,000. Jackson, Wyoming is right at 6,000, 5,700 or 6,700. I think it's 57. Anyway, right at 6,000, which is a good point in this altitude sickness. Anything over 6,000, if you get there too fast, you can get sick, and anything over 8,000 is really, really dangerous if you're not, used to it. So tell us what altitude sickness is, as you know it, and how a person dies from it, and some of the cases that you've worked in, because there's other coroners and other places that might see this. What is that all about?
Well, there's actually several different types of altitude sickness. There's acute. I've got acute mountain sickness, which is not fatal. We as coroners don't typically see somebody with acute mountain sickness. They will go to the doctor sometimes. The symptoms for that are headaches, exhaustion, shortness of breath, and nausea and vomiting. And for all 3 types of high altitude sickness per se, the cure is rapid descent down to a lower altitude, down to Denver. But most people don't recognize these symptoms as being an effect of high altitude. they think, oh, I have a touch of the flu, or I just not feeling well. I might have food poisoning. But acute mountain sickness you start to feel it above 8,200 feet.
How high is Pikes Peak?
Good question.
I know,
it's above 14,000 feet.
So the reason I ask is years and years ago, my kids were little. I'm thinking this was like in 92, as I'm recalling, and they were born in the mid 80s. So that means they were 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that. Well, we went to Pikes Peak. Well, on the way up, everything was fine, and we were up there, and it was very cold, and we come back down, and there's a halfway point there to let your brakes cool off or whatever it is. Anyway, all my kids were throwing up. They were all sick. And I think it's because, and that's what they were saying, was that, we went up, and we came back down, and the adults did kind of okay with it, but all of our kids got sick, and I would say that's because of the altitude. The change in altitude so rapid for them, going up and then trying to come back down. And I talked to the people that work at Pikes Peak up in the store, and one of them told us that they live up there. And I don't know that that's true, but they told us that they go up there and they stay for a week or two at a time before coming back down, because they got to get used to it, and they can't just go up and down every day. They've got to go up and stay for a while, and then they get switched out. So somebody comes up there and they're there for a day or two, and then they start working, and the other ones come back down. If they travel it every day, that could be dangerous. And I see what they're talking about.
Right. And I just looked up, the elevation of Pikes Peak is 14,115 feet.
Right. So no wonder they got sick.
Yeah. And the second type of high altitude sickness is called HACE, HACE. It's high altitude cerebral edema, where it's a lot of the same symptoms, except for in this case, the brain is literally swelling in your head. And you get profound inhibited mental function, hallucinations, loss of muscle coordination, severe headaches, impaired speech, nausea and vomiting, and even coma. And again, if those symptoms appear, the best treatment for that is rapid descent back down to Denver. And that's what we tell a lot of people, is like, get back down to Denver. And sometimes I'll even take them by ambulance if it's a severe case. The other one is high altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE. That's the one that I see most often. And again, that has the same symptoms as the high altitude mountain sickness. But you have extreme difficulty breathing, very rapid breathing rate, exhaustion, lack of motivation, pale complexion, and constant coughing. And you'll get some gurgling sounds coming from the chest. And with that, if somebody dies from it, a lot of times I will see a kind of a white froth coming from their nose and mouth, which is kind of like a drowning, but it's dry land drowning. Right. Basically, they're drowning from the edema that's building up in their lungs. Same
principle as opioid overdose. That's from and the other places you see that froth cone is drowning, opioid overdoses, congestive heart failure. But the same reason, it's because, with the congestive heart failure, the fluid is building up, and in the latter stages, it can be building up in your lungs. And then, of course, I did not know about this, and so that's actually trained me on something for that froth cone. Now, where I live and work, I'll never see the result of that, because I live, like I said, below 1,000 feet.
Right.
But again, people working in high altitude areas, they see that, it's like, oh, that's a drug overdose. Well, no, maybe not. Now, did the person live there the last 20 years? Maybe. But if the person is from Texas and are up here visiting, well, now you might have a high altitude sickness, so it's important to know where they're from and how long they've been there.
Right. And that's important to get a good history of where, and that's part of our forms, our scene forms that we have, that I put into our forms, is how long have they been in Summit County? When did they arrive? What is the elevation of where they live? how long did they do a stopover? Because it's recommended that if somebody's coming here from a low altitude if they're flying into Denver or driving up, to stop and take a day or two at a lower altitude, like in Denver or Colorado Springs or Pueblo, and then gradually make their ascent up to altitude. And then the effects are lessened, if not eliminated altogether. So it's a type of hypoxia is what it is. You're starving your brain for oxygen. Right. So it's and we recommend, it's always been recommended that you drink lots of water, stay well hydrated while you're here, and eating lots of carbohydrates, which I'm not quite sure what that is. I don't know if that's like an old wives' tale remedy from back in the day. And a lot of people will come up here. They go to Walmart, they have trouble breathing. They go to Walmart or Target and they buy those little canisters of oxygen that has like a little cone on it so you can breathe. And I had a high altitude death on December 5th. A woman from Texas, morbidly obese, came up and I asked the family, I said, do you guys have oxygen? Was she on a CPAP machine or anything like that? And they said, no, we have oxygen. And I said, well, is it a concentrator? Or they said, no, it's that canister right there on the dresser. And I was like, those are a waste of money. Those are not going to do anything for you. That's just a money maker for the stores. If you're really serious about it, you would need an oxygen concentrator and be on the oxygen constantly.
Yeah. Yeah. And that explains again, like when I went to Jackson, Wyoming a couple of times last year. I'm going again in a couple of weeks, like I said. But when I fly in, you land, you get out of the plane, and all of a sudden you're pretty high altitude. So it takes me a little while. Of course, I fly in the day before, I teach for 2 or 3 days, and then I fly out. I'm not used to it before I go. Or before I leave, I'm not even used to it yet. I'm just now starting to maybe be able to breathe. So when you stand and teach and talk for 8 hours, not being able to breathe, it makes it kind of tough.
It can be.
Yeah. So like elk hunters, for instance, or mule deer, any type of people that hunt like that in the mountains.
Right.
I'm sure that's something that I'm going on an elk hunt next year or later this year. And one of the things they tell us, I am probably not in the shape I should be in, but I need to start putting my pack on. I need to start walking more, walking up a bunch of mountains. I used to be a marathon runner, but that's been 10 years ago. So I've got to really get back in shape, but I can still be in shape a little. That's good. I need to do that. But still walking up in those mountains is going to be totally different than walking up the hills in Southwest Missouri. So, So that's where I could. So do you have situations where, hunters and campers and hikers in those areas suffer these same things because of high altitude sickness? They get sick, but have you had them where they've died?
Not necessarily the hikers and campers. It seems like a majority of the high altitude deaths that we get are people that are just coming up here visiting. Unfortunately, I had one that was even a 4-year-old child that was born with arterial stenosis. And he lived down in Texas, and the whole family rented a big house in Breckenridge and was going to come up for Thanksgiving. They drove up from Texas, and within 2 hours of being at altitude, and Breckenridge, where they were at, was about 9,800 feet. And within 2 hours, that child was dead. And his cardiologist, the parents were just, of course, devastated. But the dad said, well, our child was cleared by his cardiologist to fly because they'd done 2 surgeries. They'd corrected the stenosis, and his cardiologist said, yeah, he's cleared to fly. And I was like, well, there's a difference between flying in a pressurized cabin of an airplane and driving up to 9,800 feet.
Yeah.
And where your atmospheric pressure is much less, because it's not the lack of oxygen, it's the lack of atmospheric pressure that helps us take in that oxygen.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you said just a few hours he died. They just found him unresponsive.
Yeah,
Did he have any symptoms ahead of time?
Typical 4-year-old, he's running around. All his cousins are all there. They get to the house, the family's unpacking, settling in, starting to get dinner going. And he's running around playing with his cousins. Well, at 9,800 feet, and it's the less atmospheric pressure, less oxygen intake. All of a sudden, kid comes running up to mom. He's purple and blue and just keels over right there in front of mom and died.
Wow.
And paramedics arrived shortly thereafter, and they just could not revive him.
Wow.
And that, I mean, it's just tragic.
Right.
It was, and when I talked to that child's cardiologist, a few days later, they were like, why would he die? And I had to explain to a cardiologist what the effects are of coming to a high altitude are on a body that is compromised to begin with. And he didn't understand it. And that's, I'm like, okay, so many doctors at lower altitude need to be educated on what the effects of high altitude is.
Sure. Well, and side note on that, there's just because a person is a doctor does not mean they're all knowing.
Right.
Not only this, they're from low altitude Texas. This is a high altitude thing. They don't know that because they're exposed to it. But I have doctors in our area that will sign out a slip and fall in a nursing home with a broken hip that turns out to be a subdural hematoma as natural causes because they were in the nursing home and, they were dying, they were old or they were in hospice anyway, or no,
right.
That's not a natural cause of death. That's an accident from the fall. And they're like, oh, I guess I understand what you're saying, but I never would have thought of that.
Right.
You've got the medical degree, doc. I'm just a coroner.
Right. And that's an interesting point there as to the manner of death. I've always signed high altitude deaths out as a natural death. It's an acute natural disease process that the body goes through, and we've always signed them out as natural deaths. And now there is a couple of forensic pathologists that are saying, no, it's an accidental death. And I don't understand that. Maybe there's something that they know medically that I don't, but from my perspective, I think it's a natural death.
Well, I had a guy yesterday die of a massive coronary cardiac arrest, and I would say that was accidental too, because he sure didn't mean to.
That's yeah.
Right.
And people don't come up here and mean to go home in a body bag.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't. And so that brings up another rabbit trail point. Now the generic theoretical pathologist you're speaking of, is that a medical examiner county, or is that a pathologist that is contracted with a coroner county to do autopsies?
That's a medical examiner.
Okay. So, and I brought this up on something else, but medical examiners who are of that county, district, whatever, then they have the obligation to determine cause and manner, right? Just like a coroner.
Correct.
Okay, that's fine. But there are some coroners that like, for instance, ABC County doesn't have a pathologist. They're a coroner county, so they send everything down to the big university, and you've got a forensic pathologist down there at that ME's office or whatever doing the autopsy. Okay, in that case, that pathologist should not assign manner, because that's not his job. The job is to assign manner by the coroner from the county that originated from, right?
Correct.
I'm getting some feedback around the country, so people are asking me about this, because kind of similar to what you mentioned, certainly not altitude sickness, but a situation where it was, and I don't even remember. I'm going to say it was a suicide. I don't know. I'm making it up, but I think it was a suicide, and the pathologist ruled it a homicide or accident, however it was. But let's say the coroner said it was a suicide or felt it was a suicide based upon his investigation, the police investigation, all the scene information, whatever. Well, he goes to autopsy, and they write the pathologist does this and signs it out as the cause of death and the manner homicide. Well, how does that pathologist 2 hours away, how did he have the ability to sign it as a homicide? He's not investigating the scene, right? Or vice versa. Maybe it was a homicide, he signed it as suicide. Unless you're the authority, the coroner or the ME of that district, that county, that whatever, they should not be assigning manner. That's not their job. And when they put that on that paper, then that can really mess up an investigation that is seemingly going the other way, because pathologists should just look at the body, not in a vacuum, but they should get the information from you, me, the other investigators. They look at the medical findings, and then they rule a cause. And then they give that back to the coroner who determines the manner. Now, so like I said, unless they're the pathologist in charge of that ME district. But anyway, yeah, that's why I asked, because, if for him signing that as an accident, it's his area, it's his county, it's his region. He has the right to do that. But I would have to agree with you. I wonder what the reason of that would be to sign, because that's to sign that out as accident when it was a physiological death, within the body, but not from external forces.
Right. And that's where I think the totality of the circumstances has to be looked at.
Yeah.
And that's why we do a good scene investigation, and we get a good history with the family or whoever's on scene with the decedent. We get a good medical history. How long have you been here? What have they been doing while they've been here? Did they eat? Have they been having trouble sleeping? We have to get that whole total circumstance to make a good determination of, is this a high altitude death, or is there something else coming in here?
Right.
And I don't think the pathologist has that totality of the circumstances. They don't have that overall view and all of the facts.
Right. So what pathology findings could be made at autopsy besides the edema, the pulmonary edema? There really wouldn't be, would there? I mean,
there's a good article that was written by the pathologists. There's two pathologists that are calling this an accidental death. And I found their article. It was the Association of Medical Exam. His name. It was a name article. Yeah. But it was by Dr. Kurtzman and Dr. Caruso.
Okay.
And they're the ones that wrote this article, and it talks about the high altitudes, the three different types of high altitude sickness, and the causes and what they look for in an autopsy. And they even have some photographs of like the froth in a trachea, or the larynx, and some scene photos, and talk about what they look for specifically. They said that they'll see crack or hear crackling, especially with the HAPE, which you get that froth. Yeah. You're going to hear crackling in the lungs.
Yeah. Okay. So there is some pathology findings, but most of it's going to be pulmonary related.
Correct.
Yeah. Like with hypothermia, there's some times where there's a tiger striping in the stomach, but that's sometimes, it's not always, right? So that's one of those things where if it's suspected, then they look for it, but just because they don't see it doesn't mean that isn't what it is. So I was just wondering if there's things like that in these high altitude sicknesses. But again, it would be certainly a long issue. And so I do not want to go down the COVID rabbit trail, but if someone is COVID positive that is having breathing problems anyway, that could be a death sentence to go to 8,000 feet, not being from Colorado. I mean, It's
Right.
already dangerous for me to go there, but I can survive it probably as long as I take my precautions. If I feel sick, go back down. But someone with a disease like COVID attacking the lungs or something else, then that would probably almost certainly be fatal. I would think.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually the one case that I did get in early December, when I sent that decedent down for autopsy. The forensic pathologist notified me and said, "Hey, the decedent also tested positive for COVID." So then it's like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Was it HAPE or was it COVID that killed the decedent?
Right.
And we couldn't separate and make that determination.
Well, I think it would be the level of sickness she was at, right?
Right.
So if she was COVID positive, she might have been asymptomatic. But let's say she did have some symptoms. Let's say she had a few symptoms. Well, if she was getting worse with the symptoms and having difficulty breathing and all this other stuff, well, maybe it was COVID. But if she had either mild symptoms or no symptoms, I don't feel like we could put that as a COVID death. Now, not that might not have been a contributing factor to HAPE as well, right? Because, again, it's dangerous if you already have lung issues. But now, again, I think you could rightfully say it was a COVID death if she had been up there and been sick and been suffering those, breathing problems ahead of going up there. That's what I'm saying.
Right. And she didn't. From what the family told me, there were no symptoms prior to arrival at altitude. The symptoms started developing. I believe it was the next morning,
right, and
that the symptoms started developing. So that was what led me down the trail towards the HAPE.
Right. And though, she might have been just getting COVID symptoms the next morning. So you're right. You don't always know. But I would certainly say if she was COVID positive, whether she was showing symptoms or not, there's probably something working inside her body that probably contributed, even if it wasn't the actual cause.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, hey, this has been a very, very interesting conversation, and there's so much more about this probably that I don't know that we could talk about, but we're coming close on our time here. So, hey, this has been a great first episode. I actually learned, and I love to be able to learn on my own show, because that means because I'm the first to say I am not the guy that knows everything. Okay, I'd like to know a little bit about a lot, but I do not know everything. So all of that has been very interesting. So, Wendy, again, welcome to the show. I look forward to a lot of shows with you, a lot of episodes with you. We're going to kick this thing off with this episode, but again, welcome to the show. I hope our listeners reach out and welcome you as well. So until next week, Wendy, you have a great, great afternoon.
All right. Thank you, Darren.